Good morning, everyone. In case you're wondering about the particular Indian vibe on the altar, it's because today is Diwali and so is tomorrow and all the days around this week. So, as most of you know, some of us just returned from a pilgrimage in India. Shanti, myself, Lakshmi, Nivedita, we were all gone for most of September. We traveled together for about 2.5 weeks, and then also we all just did our own things. I was actually gone for a whole month, and I traveled a lot. It's probably the longest time I've spent in India in more than a decade. It was wonderful, and we have shared a lot about that trip and many things that we experienced. As I was sitting with this reading and this question yesterday, as I was meditating more and more, it almost brought a chuckle for me because all of my experiences is even just the very idea of being in India, just tuning into the heart of it, is the essence and the summary of everything that this reading was describing, at least for me, through my own little lens. And I was reminded of so many things. It almost gave me an opportunity to process and assimilate a lot of what we experienced there. I saw this Ganesha on the altar. I actually saw this yesterday because I was here. And it immediately brought a conversation back to my mind. So as I was saying, we all traveled together for 2.5 weeks, and we were in the same car. We were going to various shrines and pilgrimage sites, most of them in the high Himalayas. So there were long drives, many days just spent in the car, and we had the same driver throughout the entire time. So we sort of developed a friendship with him. He was a perfect 10 on 10, very smart, extremely pleasant personality, very willing, very helpful. So we were very, very pleased to have him with us. And as you might expect, he did not speak any English. So by default, I was always the person sitting next to him, next to the driver, and everybody else was in the back seat. It is also a role that one has to play when you go on these long drives in India, because the person who's sitting next to the driver is not supposed to sleep, because you're sometimes on the road for 8 or 9 hours straight. So you have to keep company and engage the driver so that he doesn't fall asleep. So, but there's only so much you can talk about. We didn't have a lot in common. Lakshman, that was his name. Lakshman and I didn't have a lot in common, but of course, we find things to chat about, just the places that we were in. And oftentimes, there were just these periods of silence, and Lakshman would break by telling me a joke or asking a question or something. And once we were just driving by, and he broke the silence, and he asked me, can I ask you a question? It's a spiritual question. And I was, I did not expect that. I was wondering what was about to come. Also, I was just pleased, maybe I can share something with him. Maybe there's a Kriya Yogi in the making, because he kind of had an idea. He didn't know who we were, like exactly what we did or what our path was, but he knew that we belonged to some spiritual ashram, and we were very spiritually oriented. And then I said, sure, go ahead. And then he said, he asked me, do you know how Ganesha came into being? And I said, I think so. I've heard the story. And then he went on to explain, when Ganesha was a young boy, Shiva, his dad, he beheaded him. He severed his head. And then in order to bring him accidentally, and so in order to bring him back to life, he found the head of a dead elephant, and he put that head on Ganesha's body. And so that's why Ganesha has an elephant's head still today. And then he looked at me and asked, if Shiva is omnipotent and all-powerful, why didn't he just put Ganesha's human head back on his body? Why did he have to put an elephant's head? I did not have an answer. I was groping in the dark. He and I knew the same story, and that's all we knew. And so I was still trying to answer, because he was actually asking the question. He was not joking. And so, I started saying things. I said, these gods and deities that we worship, they're like symbols. They mean something. But, these symbols came to us even before all these stories and myths came along. Ganesha having an elephant head looking that way is actually part of what we are tuning into. It's a certain reality, and we are attuning to that, to God in that form, because we create that relationship and it means something. And I was just speaking for about a minute. I have to say I'm conversant in English, but my vocabulary is very limited. So I was already struggling to communicate all these ideas to him. And I was looking at his face, and Lakshman was not very impressed. I don't know what was going on in his mind, I don't want to guess, but I could see that, the answer didn't mean anything to him. So I just abruptly stopped. I almost stopped midway as I was speaking, and I looked at him and I said, you know what? Someday, I knew that he was a devotee of Shiva, we had talked about that. Someday when you and I will reach the feet of Shiva, when we'll be with God, you can ask that question, and that is the only time you will be able to know the answer. And as soon as I said that, he looked at me and he smiled, and that was the end of the conversation. And here I was thinking, later on I got to reflect on it, and I was thinking more about it even yesterday for some reason, because I was looking at this beautiful idol of Ganesha. For most practical purposes, what I gave was a non-answer, because I didn't know why Shiva put elephant's head on Ganesha. I mean, why not just the human head? But however, as I thought about it, it also meant so much in terms of, it was not just about Lakshman. I at least felt, I don't think it is my own supposition, I felt like there was a lesson that India itself was trying to teach me. In a way, as I started approaching that question, as I started explaining, I was being philosophical, and I was being sincere in my own desire to help him or answer that question in some way, but all I was doing was dissecting his faith bit by bit and trying to explain why and what and how and all of this, and it did not appeal to him, and it somehow was quintessentially Indian. And then immediately as I stopped and I affirmed his faith, somehow that brought a lot of comfort. Affirm not in a mindless way, because that's the simplicity of devotion that you find, especially when you go to the Indian subcontinent, and that is so characteristic of that. As soon as I affirmed it, there was this joy, yes, we will be with Shiva, you will reach Shiva someday. And perhaps he knew that, perhaps he had thought about that. I don't know what he prays for or what his own relationship with Shiva is. But even to hear that being stated by somebody else almost brought a spark of joy in his eyes. And, I've been thinking about that story and so many things that transpired there. And just the simplicity of opening our own heart and what it means to relate with God. This idea of, just this question, what is the best way to pray? How do you pray? What is the right relationship with God? Every religion, every tradition tries to approach it in one way or the other. And interestingly, all of them do it differently. That's what makes so many traditions and paths and religions all around the world. And it is particularly poignant, especially for me, and I'm sure for all of us who are drawn to something like this, to watch that in play in the simple life that people sometimes lead in countries like India, their connection with God and how they express it. This past, just day before yesterday, I think, or whenever the Raja Yoga class was, we have a wonderful group of Raja Yoga students, and I happened to be giving the lecture that evening. And one of the students in the class, as soon as I started speaking, he said, would you prefer if I interrupted you if I have questions, or can I keep the questions to the end of the class? And I said, absolutely interrupt me. I work much better that way. I don't really have a skeleton. I'll figure out what to say once people start asking questions. It helps me actually to tune in and share what is helpful. And he did interrupt me, and I welcomed every one of it, and it was actually the best part of the whole class. At one point, I had written on the whiteboard, I had written the word soul, in some context, and he stopped and asked, what do you mean when you say soul? I answered the question based on Yogananda's teachings, and later on, or maybe at the end of the class, he again interrupted me, and he asked me, you speak about all of this, you speak about all these teachings in yoga with a certain conception of God that you've already subscribed to. What if somebody like me does not necessarily share that? How would you share these teachings with somebody like that if they are on a different place in the spectrum of belief? And again, I answered the question to the best of my abilities. He seemed pretty happy with all my answers. At least he looked that way. He was probably being kind. But every time I was answering one of his questions and we were having this discussion and the whole class was pretty engaged, it was very apparent, both to him and I, and actually the whole class, James was there, I'm looking at him, that you reach a point, when you try to approach these ideas, when you try to explore spirituality, you reach a point of limitation where the mind cannot go any further, the intellect just cannot dissect it anymore, and we have to use some other faculty. We have to tune into that intuition of the heart, because that is the only faculty that we have that can guide us in this journey. And again, going back to my own time in India, not just this particular trip, for those of you that have been there, I'm sure can relate to it, not only if you were Indian, but even just traveling in that country. When you get close to that idea, when you see this kind of an expression of devotion, of this relationship, it's confusing on the surface. So many deities, so many gods. It's really, even for Indians that have lived there all their life, you don't even know. Sometimes people would ask, when does the Badrinath temple open? As if every temple has an hour. No, you need to know. It's not like there are no general set of rules that all the different temples or gods or rituals follow. You need to know, what do they do in this temple? Oh, they open at 4 a.m. and they close at 10. But why? And then they open at 4 p.m. again. And then they would say, oh, today we open at 2 p.m. This is the particular day of the year. So, if you want, you can just keep asking why. And I'm sure Indians always have an answer for all of that. But really, all that you experience is just this general flow of people's faith, how they pray, how they relate to God, and what it means to them, just the power of that simplicity of faith. One of the most powerful times that I personally had was actually in this holy town called Vrindavan. I know I did a whole satsang about it a week or so ago in our community. And Vrindavan is a place that is associated with Krishna. It is the city of Krishna. It's a very ancient, sacred temple town with many, many temples. And I'm very familiar with the town. I've been there before. But this time was different because I spent a couple of days just with Ananda's work there, which is to help the widows. There are many widows that are abandoned in this place. Most of you, I think, know the background of what I'm sharing. There are all these destitute, elderly ladies who have been abandoned by their family. It's just part of culture and tradition, and it's a complicated tapestry of why we ended up where we did. And Ananda has started a charitable work in Vrindavan to help. We help about 3,000 widows. We take care of them. We have care homes for about 70 or 80, but also we take care of the other 3,000 in many, many different ways. And the first day there, the first thing I did was to visit one of these care homes. I was with somebody, one of the staff from the trust, and I brought prasad from Badrinath, which was just, again, for those of you that are familiar with India, there are these tiny balls of sugar, the size of a green pea, and there's some dried fruits and nuts in there, but mostly it's just sugar. And, I knew that they would enjoy it, so I brought a few bags of it, and I didn't realize how many people were there. There were a lot, and not that I could have brought many pounds of that from Badrinath. Maybe I could have. So I took this, and I handed it over to the lady to give to the mothers there. And she was trying to distribute and equally, make partitions of that prasad for everybody there. And she realized in most cases, she just could give this one ball of sugar to most widow mothers. So, we were going around giving these tiny balls of sugar to each person. And also, I brought candy from the US, which they were very pleased to receive. And I remember we went to one of these ladies that was just sitting on her bed. I don't think she was very mobile. And she had a tiny little altar by her bed, and we gave one ball of sugar, and immediately she took it. She was so pleased to receive it, and she put it on her altar. And the person who was next to me kept telling her, don't put it there, you will lose it, just eat it. They are like their mothers, because, these widow mothers are almost like children, and they take care of them, and don't put it there, just eat it, you will lose it, or it'll get dirty, or, she just kept pushing her to eat this tiny ball of sugar. And finally, this lady turned to the other caretaker and told her, it is so sacred. I cannot just eat it. I'm going to take my shower in the morning. I'll do my puja, and then I will do all these rituals that I do every day. Only at the end of it, I can eat this sugar ball. And of course, it was not something unusual. I could understand where she was coming from. It was For me personally, it was a powerful moment because I was thinking about all my time in Badrinath and my visits to the temple. And of course, we received a lot of sacred objects. Believe me, when you're on pilgrimage for 3 weeks, you're inundated with, water from the Ganges, rocks from Babaji's cave, prasad from Badrinath, and this from this temple. And you're just gathering and collecting. You lose track of what is from where. And in that whole busyness of it, I had forgotten to relish the sacredness and to receive what was in that ball of sugar. It was so sweet because I had packed some in my bag to bring to the US. And that day, I went to my hotel room and I actually thought I should eat just one ball of sugar so I can totally feel what this lady was feeling. And in a way, every experience that we were having, every interaction was somehow, at least in this particular trip for me, was reflecting that simplicity. I want to share another story. I wasn't sure if I was going to because it was so poignant for me when it happened. This was, again, the story of one of the widow mothers that I was meeting in these ashrams. The story almost moves me to tears every time I try to share. Hopefully I can get through it. This lady was pretty bedridden for the most part. I think she was bedridden. She didn't have any mobility to her. And then I went to her, I hugged, and she touched my face. I gave her a candy, and then I was with her for maybe a minute or two. And then she pointed to this tiny little altar next to her bed. And she had what looked like a box. And she opened the box and she showed me. And interestingly, it was something that I had never seen before. It looked a little unusual. When I looked at it closely, it was just a piece of metal. It was rectangle. And it had an image of Krishna, but it was so rusty. It was mostly rusted. And I thought to myself, that looks like a fridge magnet. One of those magnets you put on the fridge. And then I watched closely and I thought, it is a refrigerator magnet. And then, she couldn't communicate with me. She wasn't able to speak. And then the lady who was the caretaker who was giving me this tour started telling this lady's story. This lady, like many other widows, she was abandoned in Vrindavan by her own family, and it's common. It's just a very sad thing, but that's how all these women end up in these ashrams. And the family packed all of her bags. She didn't know that she was going to be left there and they were going to leave. So they left her in front of this very old temple, and she was just sitting there, and she realized by this point that she was actually abandoned, that they were not going to come back. And she started asking for alms, for food, and just begging. And gradually, passers-by started noticing that this lady was here, and they realized that she was just abandoned there. And selfishness, greed, all these things exist equally in all parts of the world. Somebody had this idea of actually stealing her bags because, she was so frail and helpless that she wouldn't be able to pursue them. So they did. Some man walked up to her. He just took her bag and started running. He knew that this lady wouldn't be able to pursue him. And she did walk behind him, just calling out and screaming and asking for her bags. She couldn't. She went a few steps, and she stopped, after a few steps, and what she found on the ground was this refrigerator magnet of Krishna. So from that moment, she has enshrined this particular piece in this box, and that became her deity. It was just so beautiful and sweet to watch in that particular setting. And just also to stop and pause for a moment, how complex we make our spiritual lives and the philosophy and everything that we consider the spiritual path to be, and to look at how simple things become. I'm just going to have a sip of water, excuse me. In that vein, every experience that comes to us, this relationship that we develop with God, it almost becomes, one might say that is a symbol. That's literally what I was thinking about, even when I was thinking of Ganesha and Shiva and the story that I shared in the beginning. At some point, you actually notice, that was the real message that I was getting to, especially with all my experiences in India. At some point, the symbol that we are looking at stops being a symbol, and it becomes an actual representation for something real. And that is true with everything in our spiritual life. And that's, in a way, what this reading itself is alluding to. We have so many pictures on the altar. I'll share a funny story just to bring us back to the room. Again, about Raja Yoga. A few cycles ago, I was greeting people in our gift shop. This was the first week of Raja Yoga. And this lady entered, and she felt very uncomfortable. She had already signed up for the class. She had paid for it. And she was visibly uncomfortable being there. I couldn't understand why. And then she asked me, it took me a minute to realize that back then we used to sell a lot of pictures to the masters, and we had hung these pictures all over the wall, in our gift shop. There were like at least 25, 30 pictures everywhere in the gift shop. And that was making her really uncomfortable. She didn't know who these people were, what these pictures were. For some reason, these pictures were all staring at her. And, she asked me, what are these pictures? Who are these people? And, I told her whatever I told her. These are the teachers we follow, and Yogananda, the author of Autobiography of Yogi, etc., etc. And then she was listening, and then she was still, I could see, a little bit uncomfortable. She came to the yoga postures, and then I thought to myself, I need to connect to her during the dinner, and I need to just speak with her more, just to let her feel comfortable, and she doesn't have to relate to or subscribe to anything in order to receive from the course. But guess what? That was the last time I saw her. She did the yoga postures before the dinner. She clearly left, and I never saw her again. But, again, as we all might understand and relate to, it's not uncommon, and you can sympathize with that, because obviously it was all unusual and alien for her. What are these pictures? Why are you all obsessed with these pictures? And then she came into the room, and there are these 5 big pictures here. Who are these people always staring at me? And why do you have them there? In a way, everything is a symbol. We have pictures. I have pictures everywhere, whether it's a picture of Master Babaji, everywhere you go in Ananda, you have all of this. And in India, you go, people just take it so many levels further. There is this one murti that thousands of people are waiting in line for hours just to catch a glimpse of for a minute, for 30 seconds. We had a priest in Badrinath who helped us navigate the crowds and get into the sanctum and all of that. But as we were sitting there, we were just watching these throngs of people just pushing each other, and just, they just pass by the sanctum. I'm not kidding you, for a brief 15 seconds, 20 seconds, and just to think about what that murti means to them. If you have not been to India and you hear all these sacred stories, one might be tempted to imagine, this is such a beautiful sacred place. I'm going to feel so uplifted. I'll just go there, meditate, tune into the vibrations. I'll just be there and soak in all of it. No such luck. It's constant chaos, and everybody's pushing each other, and for some reason, everybody just wants to see that murti for 2 minutes, that image, that picture, that idol, that which means so much to them, that ball of sugar that meant so much to this lady. It is both astonishing but also so sweet to watch that relationship, the place or the point where the symbol stops being a symbol and becomes much more than that, the living relationship that we develop with the divine. I just moved into a new apartment a few weeks ago, and one of the things that I enjoy the most is this hibiscus bush that we planted. The hibiscus flower is very close to my heart because it represents Kali, and I have a sweet relationship with it. And one morning I woke up, and from my window I see this flower that has blossomed, just one hibiscus flower, big bloom. I see it there, and it brought a lot of joy to my heart. It was just a crazy time. I was very, very busy, barely sleeping. Somehow, just looking at the flower that morning shifted everything for me. And I was thinking about that, even just for some reason, I was looking at the bush yesterday, and the thought came to my mind again. I remember in middle school, maybe most of you do, at least in India we used to do that. The hibiscus was always I don't know what you call that. It was this typical example of an ideal flower. You studied all the flower parts by dissecting the hibiscus. You had the 5 petals and the stamen and the pollen and the I don't know whatever else they're all called, but I do remember very vividly, everybody had to bring a hibiscus flower to the class, and then you had to separate all of it and maybe stick it on a piece of paper, I don't know. But we studied what the different flower parts were. And, none of those parts, no matter how much I studied the hibiscus flower, no matter how much I could dissect it, it wouldn't even begin to explain why it would make me happy. Why a flower makes us all happy. It's not a personal story. Why did God have to make the flower pretty? Why does the rose flower have to be fragrant? It performs a certain function. A flower is supposed to reproduce. It's part of a plant, and it has a biological role. But then it doesn't end there. You can dissect it as much as you want, and then it really doesn't answer the question, why do I like the fragrance of a rose? Why do I like looking at the hibiscus flower? It is in fact easier in a way to think of it in the flower or the plant as symbols and to relate to God's presence through all of that. It's almost harder to do it on the human level because of the complexity of our own ego and the way we relate to the world. But even the tiniest amount of love we feel, if you think about that, it is the fragrance of the flower. Without that, we wouldn't be able to relate to God's presence. And all that this reading is alluding to is just that. When we are in these bodies, and when we are relating, the only way we can have any conception of God is to have a personal relationship. Without that personal relationship, everything falls short. And all of spiritual path, all that we do, all that we study, all this philosophy brings a kind of clarity to our minds, which is essential to get ourselves together, to ground ourselves on the path. But ultimately, unless we learn to tap into that love, into that personal relationship, it has no ability to take us any further. I was reading something written by Yogananda describing his own relationship with Master Mahashaya. I'm sure most of you know the character in the story from the autobiography of a yogi. Master Mahashaya was a great disciple of this avatar. His name was Ramakrishna. And Yogananda himself had a very particular and very close relationship with Master Mahashaya. And he meets him after his earthly mother passes away. Yogananda's mother was very, very close with him, and Yogananda dearly felt her loss. And it is at the same time, I don't know, maybe he was guided to Master Mahashaya just for that reason. I don't quite remember how the story goes. But it was at that time that he meets Master Mahashaya almost in the place of looking for a solution. How do I deal with this grief? And then the first thing he writes is, this is not from the autobiography, but from a different place where he was describing his own relationship with the saint. He said, as soon as I entered and I saw Master Mahashaya, he said, Yogananda, he has very flowery language. He said, I felt 1,000 million times more love for Divine Mother than I felt for any living object. And that was such a powerful statement. I kept reading it over and over again. In a way, every symbol, everything that we do, every picture on the altar, every time you pick up the autobiography of a yogi, every time you listen to a piece of music by Swami, or you hear a chant, if we are able to tap into that vibration, if we are able to receive what Yogananda was receiving from Master Mahashaya, maybe not 1,000 million times, but ultimately we realize that only objective that we are all seeking is to open our hearts a little bit more and to expand that love gradually. And that can happen only when we start developing that deep personal relationship. And everything starts to shift. When you start to notice that the flower need not be pretty, God just made it so to bring us joy and to express His Spirit. Suddenly, every flower that you see starts to tell its own story, and it starts to expand ultimately that love for God we feel. So, God bless you.
Lord Most High, our Heavenly Father, all our lives we dedicate to Thee, all our labors, all our joys and woes, all our pleasure, all our melody. Make us each a channel of Thy peace. When in darkness, guide us from above. Where there's sorrow, may we sow Thy joy. Where there's hatred,